Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have stored up treasure in the last days. Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who mowed your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of armies. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have murdered the righteous who do not resist you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. You have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. This is the word of God.
Does anyone in here still like watching commercials? Anybody? See, not many of you. I didn't think so. Nowadays, the kids call them ads, if you don't know that. It is because we have streaming services, and YouTube is probably watched more than Netflix even now. So there's the little ads that pop up, and so our kids call them ads. The other day, we were explaining to our kids how it used to be when you had commercials and you couldn't record things and just pause and rewind and all that. And so you would have that 2 to 3 minute window to run and go get your snacks or to hit the bathroom or wherever, so you could get back to watch the game or the show that you were watching. And we were trying to explain that to them. Now we're probably bombarded more by ads on social media. That's probably where they pop up, maybe in your news feed or whatever. And we get to see these ads that are constantly asking us to buy something, right? Whether it's a service or a product that we didn't even know we needed, it is trying to convince us that we either need something bad enough or we want something bad enough that we will spend our money on it. Almost every ad has that goal in mind. We are constantly bombarded in our culture by this thing that will make us either more successful, maybe feel more powerful, maybe give us more control, or a big one is comfort, right? It'll make your life easier and more comfortable. I think this is so true in our world that sometimes we don't even realize it's happening. It's really in our cultural, just kind of the air that we breathe, so to speak. The reality is the culture that we live in values wealth pretty highly. So much so that we normally equate wealth with success and poverty with failure. Like we kind of just inherently believe that in many ways. Often we're attracted to things that at least make us appear wealthy, right? Even if we don't have the money, we're like, well, if I have this car, these shoes or whatever, it will make me appear a certain way. And the problem is when our pursuit of wealth and luxury becomes our singular goal and our singular aim, people get hurt in the process. It's impossible. It's not just this kind of neutral pursuit that we can engage in. And this isn't a new thing. The world of James, as our text is written in, was also no different. And towards the end of his letter, he is going to come in with some strong language, and he writes this scathing indictment on those who pursue wealth with wrong motives and at the expense of others around them, taking shortcuts to supposed successes instead of patiently working and waiting on God to care for them. So as James does, he's going to present us two clear paths: the path of shortcuts or the path of patience. And which path we take will reveal where our trust really lies, whether in self or in God. So good morning again, church. My name is Joel McCarty. I get to serve as one of the pastors and elders here at New Eden, alongside Kevin, our pastor for shepherding, and as we seek to raise up lay elders alongside them as well, which we'll be voting on, reminder members, and one of our elders, potential elder candidates on December 10th at our family meeting. So come to that if you can. I'm excited to be here as always. I'm excited to be a member here at New Eden and just be a part of what God's doing. I've been in a really weird space this week, so this sermon is pretty scattered. It feels that way to me, and I normally don't like that. So I'm just going to give you a heads up. It will not, I don't think it will be a rambling, long, scattered sermon. I think it will be a short, scattered sermon. So bear with me. If it's all over the place, I think it'll be okay. You'll be out of here soon. We'll sing some more songs. I'm trusting the Spirit to do the work. And the truths of the scripture are gonna be there regardless, and he'll fill in the gaps. So I'm just giving you a heads up. If it feels a little scattered, it is. So we are continuing in the book of James. James chapter 5, 1 through 11 is what we're going through. We only have 2 more weeks, this week and next. So next week we'll finish out the series. We just heard the text read. If you were paying attention, James has some of the hardest things to say. Now, he's not minced words throughout the book, but today he really comes at it probably, I think, just the strongest, harshest, kind of black and white language that he has in the entire text is in our text this morning. The text is pretty straightforward. It's really broken into 2 parts. Verses 1 through 6 are about the dangers of the pursuit of wealth and the way that it harms people as it's happening. And then verses 7 through 11 are going to call the weak among them, those that are in the midst of suffering, to incredible resilience and patience. How they are to find their perseverance in an active trust in God's work. At the core of our passage, even though it's talking about wealth and talking about patience, at the core of it is, who do we trust? Self in our pursuit of wealth to just build our kingdom and make everything as comfortable as possible? Or do we trust God and his eternal work that's happening? And so that's kind of how we're going to work our way through the text. It's just the 2 things, the pursuit of wealth and the patience of the weak. So let's first look at the pursuit of wealth by looking at verses 1 through 6. I'm going to start by reading verse 1 of our text again. It says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you." So James calls to attention what our text defines as rich people. Okay, so he says, "Come now, you rich people." He's calling them to listen. He calls them to weep and wail. Now, context of this passage and all of Scripture reveals that James isn't saying it's inherently wrong to be rich. We just heard a verse read where it told the rich in the world who are Christians to not be arrogant, to not rely on their wealth, right? So James isn't inherently saying that it's wrong to be rich. In fact, many of God's servants throughout history have been people of wealthy means. Some of the patriarchs of old, Abraham had a lot of land and he was given a lot. Many of the business women in the time of Jesus that were Christians funded the ministry of Jesus so he could go around and do what he was doing, right? So people have gained wealth through it either being given to them or through ethical means, and they've stewarded it rightly for God's purposes. That does happen. But much more common is the one who has gained wealth by hoarding, through oppression, and even murder at times. And these are the specific rich people that James is talking to. Now, most likely commentators are in pretty much unanimous agreement on this, that this is probably not to Christians within the body that James is writing to. It's probably intentionally, knowing that this letter would be passed around, to those kind of on the outside. People that have been persecuting some of the Christians, and James has a prophetic word for them. He's probably conjuring up his Old Testament prophetic voice more clearly in this passage than any others. The role of Old Testament prophets was to bring clarity to situations, to cut through the nuance, and to even say, hey, this is the end result of the way you're living, right? This way leads to life, this way leads to death, and that's what James is doing. He's saying, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Regardless of what it looks like in the here and now, what's coming in the future, because of the way you've lived your life, you should be weeping and wailing over. This harsh language is meant to wake them up from their ways of oppression and wickedness and reveal to them that even though it may be enjoyable now, the end is destruction. So James is writing to this outside audience, but he does know that his primary audience of the whole letter are brothers and sisters, Christians. And so he's writing with them in view as well. This prophetic word we're not meant to gloss over. Well, that's not me, so I don't need to hear that. That's not what's going on at all. This prophetic word is for those in the church who might be tempted to believe that wealth equals success. To those who would live lives of indulgence, if they could. Just because we don't have money doesn't mean we don't have the love of money and that we want that. I think that would solve all of our problems. He's writing to those who might have been impartial toward those who were poor. We read about that earlier in the book of James, right? Those that might be impartial towards those in power because they thought, well, if I'll kind of buddy up, they can make my life easier. James wants to make it clear that the end result of the pursuit of wealth and the love of money is destruction. So he tells the rich to weep and to wail, and he indicts them for 4 different things. So the context tells us these are the specific rich people he's talking to. And the first thing he tells them they have done is they've hoarded things. They're hoarding. Look with me at verses 2 through 3 again, and we'll see this. He says, your wealth has rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have stored up treasure in the last days. James warns against this amassing of stuff. The example he gives is that you have so much stuff, like clothes, for example. You have so many clothes that you don't even have time to wear them all, so they're just becoming moth-eaten. I heard one commentator say the only reason our clothes aren't moth-eaten today is because we have mothballs. But we have plenty of clothes. And he says that all of this, the clothes, the money that's rotting, you don't even have time to use all this stuff that you've just kind of amassed and hung on to, that this stands as a witness, an indictment against you. They were storing up treasures in the last days. That's language last days that I believe starts at the time of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection, and we're still in it now. We're still in the last days. And he says, you're storing up treasure in these last days for things here and now, instead of using it to bless those around you, which stores up treasure in heaven. None of us are given stuff to hoard it and hang on to it. Rather, we are all blessed to be a blessing. But when the amassing of wealth is like your end game, your goal in life, you'll do anything to get it and you'll do anything to keep it once you have it. So not only were they hoarding, but they were also actively oppressing those under their power. In verse 4, James says, look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who mowed your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of armies. We're reminded of when the Israelite slaves were under the Egyptian rule, and they cried out and God heard their cries. In this culture, the wealthy could gain more wealth and power through the acquisition of land. This was the most common way that this was done, and it was normally done legally, but in unethical ways. Just because something is legal and possible, according to the tax code or whatever, doesn't make it necessarily ethical. There were specific laws against the withholding of wages in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 24:14-15 says, do not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether one of your Israelite brothers or one of the resident aliens in a town in your land. You are to pay him his wages each day before the sun sets, because he is poor and depends on them. Otherwise, he will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be held guilty. Now, I'm not making a case for daily deposits into your bank account, though that could be a thing for certain employers might choose to do that to care for their employees because people have those needs. Every culture is different, but the heart here is that the wealthy were taking advantage of the poor because they knew they had no recourse. They didn't have the funds to go to court. They didn't have the funds to go argue and get a lawyer and do all this. And so they would drag them on often, saying, we'll get that pay to you. We'll get it. Don't worry. And drag them on. No intention of doing so. The rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. And James says that this is actually a moral issue. It's not a political issue, as we often make it. It's a moral issue. So they're hoarding wealth, they're oppressing workers, and James says on top of all that, while this is happening, they're living luxurious lives of indulgence. James 5:5 says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. James says that while others are dying around you, you're enjoying your luxurious lives with no thought of what is happening, thinking it's not my problem. I didn't get myself in that mess. This reminds us of the prophet Amos. I've been reminded that a lot reading through this when we went through the book of Amos a few years back. He had similar things to say. And he says, you've got all this excessive stuff. You're living in comfort and luxury. You're indulging yourself on anything you want. And what you don't understand, you're actually ripening yourselves for destruction. Jesus says that, the way Jesus said this is he said that those that do this have your reward already, which is actually a very, very like sobering thought. If you live for all the stuff of this age, Jesus says, okay, you can have it, but you have your reward. Luke 6:24-25 says, this is Jesus talking. He says, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your comfort. Woe to you who are now full, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are now laughing, for you will mourn and weep. The pursuit of wealth at any cost is immoral because it leads to hoarding, oppression, and indulgence. But not only that, James shows that it leads to death. Look at verse 6. He says, you have condemned, you have murdered the righteous who does not resist you. These people James is talking to, their pursuit of wealth had gotten so bad that they were willing to get rid of anything or anybody that stood in their way. Now, this could have been active murder. We see examples of that in the Old Testament when Jezebel murdered Naboth because he refused to sell his vineyard to Jezebel's husband, Ahab. And so they murdered Naboth. That could have been going on. It could have also been what was known in this culture as judicial murder. We even have this where we recognize that even though someone's not physically killed, they're in prison for life and there's no way of them getting out. They're effectively, their life as they knew it is over. And this would happen through a debtor's prison where they might be thrown into prison for the smallest of debts, maybe a very unjust loan that was given with incredibly high interest, and the person in poverty had no other hope but to take it, trying to feed their kids, family, whatever. They end up in prison and these debts just accumulate over time and they'll never get out. But either way, whether this was active murder or more a passive just result of the way people were being oppressed, the result was the same: death at the hands of the immoral wealthy. And James makes it clear that this is not okay. So as we work our way through this, there's probably a little bit of heaviness. First of all, because we live in a culture that has a lot of these things. And we would say, yes, I believe the text is primarily talking to those on the outside of the church, though we are tempted to also, I've been convicted quite a bit as I've been reading through this. I got a lot of stuff that I'm not doing anything with, and that's purposeless in my life, that I'm not stewarding well. So we're willing to sit in that, right? Because I think we can read through this and think, well, that was only a problem back in the day of James. But these things, hoarding, oppression, indulgence, and murder, they still go on today, right? It is amazing the amount of wealth that's hoarded through things. I mean, the amount of stuff that the average American has just sitting around that isn't ever used, that's just rotting, is crazy. So I think we need to be willing to say we're going to submit ourselves to text and think about that. Right? Just think about the way our stuff is used and the accumulating a bunch of stuff. Active oppression still takes place today, whether it comes from individuals or systems. It's a real thing. Examples, just a few. I'm not trying to cover all these things. I know there's people who pay somebody less money because of their immigration status, knowing, well, they can't report me, and so we're just going to pay them a little bit less. I know there's oftentimes harsher prison sentences for drugs that tend to flow in low-income communities. There are that flow among the wealthy. That's another one. You can actually track how good of a plea deal someone gets based on their income level. It's very interesting that the plea deals that are given to those that are often more wealthy. N.T. Wright points out how we often scoff at the idea of debt forgiveness for the poor, but many of us don't bat an eye when it comes to the government bailing out billion-dollar companies, right? And again, this is not trying to get political, right? I don't have all the answers to all this stuff. What I am saying is that I think we need to think soberly and rightly about these things and not just be like, well, it's just the cultural waters we swim in. So those are some more maybe systemic examples, but even on an individual level, this happens. Employers taking advantage of their employees. Just us, we spend countless amounts of money on entertainment and luxury every year. I'm not saying it's wrong. Go take your kids to see a movie. We're gonna go see Trolls this week sometime. I don't know. There's nothing wrong with enjoying good gifts. That's not what I'm after. But this just kind of overabundance of stuff. And in the pursuit of wealth, death does take place. I mean, there are people in our world who die because they don't have access to sustainability, access to housing and food and things like medical care. And again, none of this, I'm trying to be political. I'm trying to make the point that James makes, right? I'm not smart enough to give you a political answer to all these things. I'm really not. But this pursuit of wealth at any cost for the sake of power, comfort, and security, it does actually harm people. It does actually hurt people, and it's actually immoral. So James makes that clear. So let's just, however that fleshes down in our life, let's just kind of come to the table and say, we're going to submit to the text, that's clear. And then what he's going to do, which is what we're going to do right here, he's going to turn to encourage his brothers and sisters. He uses the language of brothers and sisters or my beloved 3 times in this short span. Like, I feel like it's the most he does, because he's like, hey, you're in the midst of this. And many of these people in this culture have been recipients of the harm and the hurt of this culture. And many of them are suffering. And so look what he says in verse 7. He turns from this scathing indictment, and then he says, therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. We saw the pursuit of wealth, and now we see the patience of the weak. James tells his brothers and sisters that even though the world is messed up, even though the systems of the world, and it's not our culture, the systems of the world at large reward the wealthy and punish the weak, even though it does seem like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, be patient. Now, this response is incredibly countercultural. And again, the way of Jesus does not line up in any political categories. Like, you would think it would be like, hey, let's have this physical revolution. Let's overthrow the wealthy. Let's overthrow the government. Let's just flip the tables and let's get what once was the rich, let's flip it over, and now we're in charge. And we'll make better choices, right? That's not the call he gives to the church. He says, be patient. Now, this is not a passive acceptance of injustice or the way things are. We're going to see that in a moment. But it is this active, militant patience, this waiting on God to show up and work because he's promised to do so. In context, James starts this call to patience by talking to believers who had been actively harmed or hurt by the world at large, by either the religious elite of the day or by some of the political powers of the day. But I do believe that it's a faithful application to apply what he's about to tell us, how to wait with patience, that it's a faithful application to apply it to all types of suffering. He seems to broaden it because he talks about Job, who did not face active oppression by anybody other than Satan, right? But he still uses Job as an example of patience and suffering. So as we go through these things, regardless of where you find yourself, honestly, most of us in here, now some of you might have a really maybe unethical boss. I'm not saying that like we can have these situations where we're put in these positions, but most of us aren't being actively persecuted, but I know all of us are walking through some type of suffering. And so as we walk through this, think through what patience looks like. The first thing he tells us in verse 7 and 8 is to wait with anticipation. He says, therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. And he gives this example. He says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains? You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. And so he gives this example of this farmer who has done the work, right? He wasn't passive. He did the work. He tilled the soil and he put the seeds in the dirt, and then he did what he was supposed to do, and then he just sat back and waited. And you go back out the next day and it looked like nothing's changed. Right? You go back out the next day, it looks like nothing's changed, right? And however long that process was, depending on the type of fruit, he had to sit back and wait on a process that he had no control over. And in the same way as a farmer waits for the plants to appear, in the same way we're actively waiting on God to show up and produce fruit in the midst of our suffering. And so we wait. He says the Lord's coming is near. One example I heard, it was just like for maybe a mom and a dad, when it comes October, you say Christmas is here. And a kid, it's like, not like they feel like it's way down the road, right? Because two different perspectives. And so the Lord's coming is near. We might not always see it. We might not always understand it, but it is near. He will work. He will show up. And so we wait with that anticipation. And then in verse 9, he tells us to wait with kindness and unity. Look at what he says in verse 9. He says, brothers and sisters, don't complain about one another or grumble or groan so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. In verse 9, he warns the church that in times of stress to not turn inward and start self-fighting, right? That's just pretty good advice, James. Like, he just recognizes that when the church is in the midst of these times of stress and suffering, the tendency is to grumble, to groan, to complain. Right? And if when me and my wife, when it's stressful, we have to be careful, right? And we don't always do it well, but it's like, hey, are you actually mad at me, right? Or are we just like stressed right now? And you just like, you're just kind of taking this out. And so James is like, hey, don't do that. Strive towards unity. The enemy are not your brothers and sisters in Christ. The enemy is the enemy, the evil one, the Satan, the one who's sowing division. And so it's just practical advice. Wait with kindness and unity. And then in verse 10, we're told to wait with boldness. This is where you start seeing it's not this passive acceptance. He says, brothers and sisters, verse 10, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. He says, look at the prophets. I mean, the prophets, like literally one of their main jobs was to go like speak to people in positions of power, whether they were the religious leaders who were taking advantage, these people who were supposed to be shepherds and they were taking advantage of God's people, or they were like political leaders like kings and those in authority who were not submitting to God's good rule and reign. And they were just literally supposed to go like tell them, like basically tell them off. Like, it's like, that sounds like a fun job, right? Like go speak to the people. And often they were thrown in prison and things like that. And he says, here's an example. But they trusted God so much that it wasn't this thing where they were angry at these political leaders or religious leaders. It was that they were speaking truth in love, saying, hey, look, here's what God has said. Here's the good way. And so they do it with love. They're not fighting with their fists, but they're fighting with their words, because we can't use the methods of the world to try to fix the problems of the world. That's our tendency. We see things wrong, and so we want to retaliate with violence, with anger. And the way of Jesus says, no, it's not that we don't speak. Sometimes we speak up. Sometimes we're called to speak out, but we do it for motivation of love. I think a great example of this have been watching pastors in our own city, in the city of Decatur, in the situation of Steve Perkins, where he was killed, and they're calling for justice. You go watch them at the city council. And not everybody's doing it for motivation of love. I'm not going to pretend there is, right? There's some anger there. But there's also, I think, some righteous indignation and some just calling for accountability, transparency, and justice, saying, hey, we love this city. We love you guys. We love this. We want justice in this case, right? And waiting with boldness. I mean, I've been encouraged by that, honestly. That's one of the biggest encouragements in this whole situation that is a little bit of a mess, right? And the last thing he calls, so he's saying to wait with anticipation, wait with kindness and unity, wait with boldness. And the last thing he says is to wait with hope. Look at what he says in verse 11. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. You have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. So James gives us probably the most classic example of a sufferer in the scriptures. This man named Job, this ancient story about this person who faced inexplicable suffering in his life. You might remember the story. I'll recap it quickly. He had a lot of wealth. He had a beautiful family. He had anything that anybody of this world looking from the outside in would say was a successful life. He walked with God. But all that was taken from him. Satan came and said, hey, the only reason he's walking with you because you've given him stuff. Of course he is. And so all that is taken away from him, starting with his wealth, his family, eventually his own health is stripped away from him. And through it, I mean, you're like 42 chapters of this, like, right? I mean, it is a great, just realistic look into suffering. Friends saying stupid things, right? You guys have been there, you're suffering, your friend says something they think is helpful, and you're like, oh, it wasn't helpful at all. Like, I know you love me, but, you know, so like you get to see all this through the midst of it. Job endures. He didn't do it perfectly. He had questions like any of us would, but he did endure. And in the end, as we see even in our text here, it was the Lord that brought about this outcome that eventually restored to him everything he had lost plus some. And James says that the same blessing is in store for those who are patient, so we can wait with hope. Now, I think it's important because we read the story of Job, and what stands out to us from our lens, because we're all about stuff, is that he had stuff restored to him, right? But if you really think about it, do you really think that him having some more kids just kind of, was, oh, well, my old kids, forgot about them. This kid's a little better anyway. So that's not how it was. There was still loss and sadness and grief. See, the physical restoration that Job experienced is a piece of his story. We will all, either in this age or the age to come, experience full physical restoration for all the losses that we experience if we're followers of Jesus. But the ultimate blessing he got was not physical wealth. It was that he got to see God. And this, church, is the ultimate hope that we have in our suffering. Look at what Job says in Job 42:5. I had heard reports about you. This is the end of a life of suffering and pain and agony. He says, I'd heard about you. I followed you in a sense, but now my eyes have seen you. The ultimate hope that we have in the midst of our suffering, the ultimate hope that we have in the throes of our weakness, in the lowest of our lows, is not that we'll just get out of it and get some physical relief. It's that we might more clearly see God. See, all of us, no matter who we are, find ourselves under the oppression of sin and death. Even physical oppression, active oppression that some of you might have faced, or you've been sinned against, whether you would call it oppression or not, maybe you've been abused, whatever it is that's in your story, in your past, those are all physical outworkings of the fact that sin has entered the world and it has a hold on humanity. We have all faced suffering. No matter what our outward appearances show, we might look like we have it all together. We might look at the depression rates among the wealthy. No matter what it looks like on the outside, if we're honest, from the wealthiest to the poorest, we have found ourselves weeping and wailing, not only because of the miseries that are coming on us, but the ones that are here. And here's why I think I've wrestled with this text, and why I say it feels like all over the place to me a little bit, is because we're not only victims in systems of oppression, we've also found ourselves playing the part and aiding in its wicked endeavors. We have all been sinned against, and we are all sinners against other people. So I read this and I'm I don't even know what to think. Where am I supposed to be convicted? I don't know. I'm convicted of my own complicity as I amass things and stuff and desire that in my heart wants that. I question my own motives. And at the same time, I find myself in incredible weakness and suffering often. Saying God, fix the mess. This world is broken. Can you do something about it, please? And so what is the answer? Wherever we find ourselves, or this weird stew of emotions and mix, because that's how we are as humans, where we have the dignity of God in us and there's incredibly beautiful things we can do. And then we also are sons and daughters of the father of lies, the Satan, the evil one. And we're doing incredibly wicked things. What's the hope? Who can redeem and save and make all this new? Who can fix hearts that are broken? See, what kept Job going in the midst of his suffering was not just hoping he could get out of it. In the thick of his pain and agony, in the middle of the book of Job, look at what he says. He's just weeping and lamenting, and then he says, but I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the end, he will stand on the dust. This is some sweet by and by. This is real. You can touch this. You can feel this. This is tangible. Even after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see God in my flesh. I will see him myself. My eyes will look at him, and not as a stranger. My heart longs within me. As the deer pants for the water, my soul longs for you. There was a lot that Job did not know. but he knew that his Redeemer lived and that he would see him face to face. This is like probably one of the earliest stories recorded in the Bible. This is well before Jesus came and walked among us. And there was something that he knew, a Messiah would come. See, the thing that both humbles the wealthy and that encourages the poor is the same. The judge is coming. He stands at the door. And so instead of trying to figure out what category we find ourselves in, depending on the day you wake up, are you the wealthy? Are you the poor? I don't know. Like, it's all relative. Instead of that, the question is, where do you place your trust? Where is your hope? Is it in self and amassing stuff? That can be an evidence of that. If so, the fact the judge is coming is pretty bad news, actually. But if our hope is in Christ alone, if we say we have nothing to bring to the table, I don't care what it looks like on the outside, I don't care what I've been gifted with from a worldly perspective of wealth, like I have nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling. Naked, come to thee for dress. Helpless, look to thee for grace. If our hope is in Christ, then the fact the judge stands at the door is good news. We want the judge to come, make things right, rule with justice. Nobody in this world can but him. Jesus came as the hope for both the oppressors and the oppressed because he came to end the source of all oppression, which is sin. He's dealing with it, guys, like at its root. Like earthly governments can only like put band-aids on things. And I'm not saying we shouldn't strive for that. Like we want communities that are life-giving and that flourish. But at the end of the day, we need someone to come like make all things new. And that's what Jesus came to do. He came to save us from death. He was born of a virgin. He came in silence as a baby. This is so upside down. Yet he lived the perfectly righteous life. There is no one who can really read James 5:6 and say you have murdered the righteous and say, well, that's me. It's interesting that this passage where it says you have condemned, you have murdered the righteous. This is a singular word here. Who does not resist you. Yes, it applies to Christians who have been persecuted for their faith, but it chiefly applies to one, and that's Jesus. He was led to the cross by those who hated his message. Yet he did not fight with violence or retaliation. He did have the power to take everything and just flip it over. He could have done that, but to do so would have meant destroying everybody. And because he loved us, he gave up his own life. No one takes it from me, he said. You think they're taking this from me? I lay this down on my own. I surrender my life to the Father. That's why on the cross, one of his last words as he breathed his last was, Father, into your hands I give you my spirit. Full surrender, full trust, not taking anything for himself, but saying, I give it all to you. And just like a farmer that lays down seed in the earth, hoping it will produce fruit, the body of Jesus was laid in the grave to rest. And after 3 days of patient waiting, the earth would bring forth fruit on the third day. As Jesus rises from the grave to conquer sin and death, to end all of this. He has risen. The roots of evil have been done away with. And so what he does, he invites all of us, like me, who come to this text and say, I don't even know what my problem is really at the end of the day. I don't know if I need to be saved from other people or from my own heart. And you know what? It's probably both. So I just come and I lay it all down and say, it's yours. You can take this messed up, jacked up life. And in exchange, I'm going to get your righteousness. I'm going to get your hope. And so we trust that he can take and make all things new. And here's the thing. The hope of our text is yes in that, but it's also in what's still to come. We're about to enter Advent season, the season of patient waiting. And in that, we wait for Christ to return and make all things new, like he did the first time when he started it, and he's going to finish it. And so that's what we wait for. Jesus is coming back, church. Like, and if that's not true, then this is, it's a mess. You might as well as eat, drink, be merry, tomorrow we die. Like I mean that. Just get what you can. But Jesus is coming back. That's what gives the persecuted church around the world that really does get active persecution and oppression because they name the name of Christ, it gives them the hope to endure and remain steadfast. Martyrdom is stupid without the resurrection. But because Jesus has beaten death, there's nothing more to fear. This is what causes us to be okay with being misunderstood and maligned. We know the judge will vindicate us in due time. We don't have to answer every accusation. We don't have to retaliate in anger. This is what allows us to release our grip on the pursuit of wealth. And if God's gifted you with stuff, we can use it for his glory, not our own. This message actually changes us. We don't have to hoard, we can give generously. We don't have to oppress others, we can care for them. Employers that are Christians should be the best employers in the world. Employees too. That'll be another text someday. We don't selfishly indulge. If we're given good gifts, enjoy them. Invite others into them. Don't hoard it. There's nothing wrong with enjoying good gifts, but it's not this overindulgence. We don't live lives of hatred, but rather of radical love. And this wasn't shorter like I said it was going to be. I don't know what happened. Less notes and more time. But this is what allows us to walk through suffering and sickness and loss like Job and say, and you can't say this without trust in a resurrection, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, because we know that my Redeemer lives and we will see him again, face to face, with your own eyes, not through a glass dimly, not as a stranger, but as a friend. And this is the hope that is sure and the hope that awaits us.